Hi, welcome to part one of my Imperfect Victim series on Britney Spears, who is probably the most important imperfect victim of this channel, as what we did to this woman basically shaped how I view pop culture as a whole for my entire life, and is basically the reason that this channel exists in the form that it does. So, watching the way the public destroyed Britney is fundamental to why this channel exists, and it changed the way that I think about celebrity. Britney was one of my first idols. I've loved her since I was a little girl, and I watched this world shred her to pieces in real time. I didn't understand it then, but I understand it now as a coordinated cultural failure, a system that refused to protect a young woman from exploitation and then punished her for reacting to it. And I need to be clear that this story is not just about Britney. It's about how we manufacture trauma as entertainment and then act morally superior when the person we traumatize starts to bleed in public. This part is about the machine that destroyed her. How a teenage girl was turned into public property, and how that cultural permission structure, everything that came later, feel normal even though it was fundamentally monstrous. So let's get started. So Britney Spears' fame was a form of captivity. She was captive in a kind of way that fundamentally just doesn't exist anymore. She was hunted like an animal, picked apart, and systematically disassembled for sport in a culture that did not allow a beautiful woman, a sex symbol, to also be a human being with feelings and emotions. Britney had to be perfect, sexy but innocent, desired but pure, a fantasy but also a moral battleground. There was no room for her humanity, her confusion, her anger, her exhaustion, her postpartum depression, or even her growth. There was no room for mental health as well, in an era that didn't even have the language to treat famous people like people, and much less did not have the language to treat each other as people at the time. A lot of the mental health language is a new development in the 2010s and 2020s. From the beginning, Britney wasn't living life. She was essentially being managed as an object that the public felt entitled to consume. And in order to really understand what happened to Britney Spears, you need to understand that she was famous at that time in a way that people are not famous anymore. She was ubiquitously famous in a monoculture that doesn't exist anymore. People will compare her fame to someone like, Taylor Swift, who is probably the most famous person right now. And while Taylor is massive, Britney is Taylor at her total height. So I would say like Eras Tour Taylor, but multiply that shit by like five or 10. Britney was famous in a world where no one could opt out. There were no social media algorithms. There was no streaming. There wasn't a segmented internet ecosystem. There was no corner of the internet. It was one cultural feed, one set of magazines, one set of standards, and Britney totally dominated that, okay? Everybody knew her, everybody watched her, everybody had an opinion, whether they liked her or they fucking hated her. And everyone felt entitled to her body, her emotions, and her relationship like she belonged to them. Her level of fame, I think the only true comparison is Michael Jackson, because she transcended demographics in a way that modern celebrity rarely does. And she became globally famous at 15 or 16 years old, before her identity or her boundaries or her sense of self had fully developed or had any chance to develop outside of surveillance. Her entire adult identity was formed under judgment and scrutiny and extraction, and under a pressure that was so constant that it was almost inevitable that at some point there would be some kind of fracture. And the public was rife to consume her when that fracture happened. I have said many times on this channel that fame is inherently traumatizing. And how much more can fame be traumatizing to the most famous woman in the entire world who's currently living? That trauma was inevitably inescapable. Another thing you need to understand about the time that Britney Spears was famous was that it was the early 2000s. And the early 2000s for women was a psychologically violent era. It was not just messy tabloid culture, it was psychological warfare, essentially, against women. There was open misogyny, open racism, open voyeurism, open humiliation of women just for entertainment. It wasn't controversial, it wasn't questionable, it wasn't too far. It was totally normalized. I think right now, the younger generation right now is reckoning with America's Next Top Model, right? The documentary that just came out. And I want you guys to understand that what Tyra said and did was what that all the horrors and all the things everyone's gasping and clutching their pearls about, that was the best of the early 2000s. What Britney experienced was the absolute worst of it. This was Us Weekly culture, TMZ, Perez Hilton at his worst. I know he's repented now, but I don't know. He's got, to be honest, blood on his hands, so whatever. The way we spoke about women in pop culture would actually horrify you. If you guys are horrified by America's Next Top Model, you should see some of the articles that we read back in those days. Honestly. Basically, we would their upskirt photos were normalized, and then the women would be slut shamed when literally a paparazzi would lay on the ground and take pictures of them up their skirts. Disgusting. And basically, women were slut shamed for being violated. I think Paris Hilton, who is an inevitable subject of this Imperfect Victim series, is a great example where literally a revenge corn on the cob act was committed against her, and we all as a public totally slut shamed her, and it was horrific, right? This sexual harassment was essentially a punchline at the time, and we weren't just watching the women, we were basically consuming their degradation as content. If you want a snapshot of the casual cruelty of that era, I would recommend the book Girl on Girl. I read it recently. I thought it was pretty good. And it's not even the full story. It's basically just proof of the cultural cruelty in that moment. The system in its entirety rewarded cruelty towards famous women, and both financially and with attention, and with financially and with the rapt attention of a hungry and vicious public. The paparazzi hunted Brittany like a animal, okay? They basically engineered a situation where she had no psychological or bodily autonomy. They constantly swarmed her, blocked her cars, crowded her physically. There was a situation where she was trying to run from the paparazzi, and she had her baby in her arms, and the baby almost fell down, and then we shredded her and ripped her apart because the baby almost fell out of her arms. Britney Spears almost dropped her baby, and then there's these subsequent pictures of her crying at a diner because I think she knew what was coming, and what she was afraid of definitely is exactly what happened. The paparazzi would shout invasive insults and sexual insults to her to provoke reaction, because the reaction was the product that they were paid for. That is what they got money for. They basically treated her distress as entertainment instead of evidence of injury. And as she became more distressed, they hunted her with that much more vigor. There was never any cultural empathy. It was only consumption. We as a culture funded it, paid for it, and demanded it. And we basically turned her breakdown into content and called it pop culture. This constant surveillance, honestly, would destabilize any human being because of the fact that they are simply human. No human being is built to tolerate that level of harassment, stress, and physical attacks and personal and psychological attacks. Anybody would crack under that level of pressure. And I think a beautiful and soft and gentle soul like Brittany was also somebody who was most likely to crack. So Britney's image was engineered in such a way that is actually a little bit disturbing if you think about it. She was supposed to be this innocent virginal schoolgirl, but also supposed to be sexy and erotic with this girl next door innocence. It was a dichotomy that sold really well, but also made her the subject of a lot of really disgusting scrutiny. It was basically a brainchild of adults in corporations deciding what a teenage girl should represent and what would sell the most. And she was wildly successful as a product. But what they did to her, the image they created for her, is ultimately and inherently constricting and makes it very difficult for her to develop and evolve as an artist and as a human being. She was basically expected to carry the sexiness of a schoolgirl while also embodying purity culture. This was a time when purity rings were like all the rage, and Brittany made the mistake of telling us that she was a virgin, which she was later ridiculed for at a later time. It basically never didn't leave her any room to grow or mature or evolve without getting punished for it. And she tried to grow and evolve. There's songs like Overprotected, My Prerogative, Oops, I Did It Again. Like, these are songs where she's trying to push the bounds of the confines of the cage that we put her in. But she was shamed relentlessly for that, and like slut shamed for that, right? And degraded and moralized. That freedom, that the same sort of sexual freedom that men were praised for in like rap music, and also even like her ex Justin Timberlake was praised for, was evidence of her being a bad example, and a bad example for young girls, which was like really disgusting to put all that weight on one woman, you know? The public also loved the way that she was sort of dehumanized and made into a symbol, because it gave them permission to treat her like an animal and do and say whatever they wanted to say about her. And it wasn't just the tabloids. Mainstream media also treated her like a spectacle as well. Interviewers, both male and female, for instance, like Diane Sawyer, for instance, asked her degrading, sexualizing, humiliating questions as if it was normal to interrogate a teenage girl about her virginity, about her implants, about her body on national television. She basically was forced to respond to threats. There's a very memorable interview I remember actually vividly, someone telling her, I think on TRL, that like, oh, this mother in Ohio said that she like wants you like unalived. And she was like, she had to like respond to that. Another interview that they have played clips of in the documentaries and stuff, where a French interviewer's like, we want to talk about something that everybody's talking about. And she was like, your breasts. It's disgusting, horrific, gross, you know? She was basically treated like a consumable object and forced to perform good girl under interrogation. And that trained her, the public, to see her in the same way, as an object, as a spectacle, as a person whose suffering was content to be consumed and mocked and ridiculed. The other grave injustice that we did to Britney Spears is that her artistry and her creative vision was constantly and repeatedly minimized in the public. Britney was never fully taken seriously as an artist. And I think that that was actually ultimately strategic. Because if people really believe Britney was a manufactured doll, and they believe that she had no authorship and no autonomy and no intelligence, no vision, then the conservatorship that came later seems like a logical outcome and a logical conclusion, if not even necessary, which is how it was thought of at the time. It felt like managing someone who was going crazy, you know, as opposed to a person who deserved empathy. But the truth is, Britney was a visionary. She shaped her image, her aesthetic, and her performance identity. People who worked with her at the time always spoke about the fact that she had such a clear artistic vision. She was involved in every aspect, in the sound engineering, in the writing, in the artistry, in the music, you know? And collaborators have constantly repeated this. The narrative that she was just a produced product erased her authorship and minimized her personhood, which made her that much easier to strip of human rights later on when the conservatorship happened. Because it trained society to accept a central lie, which is that Britney did not belong to herself. So who protected Britney? The short answer is no one. No one, okay? The difference between people who survive the kind of fame that Britney experiences and people who don't is protection. It's a stable, like someone who to act as a buffer between the outside world who's consuming you like an animal, and to have a creation of like an inner world where you're protected and where you're loved for being just who you are. Britney never had that. Britney never had anybody who was going to say no on her behalf in order to protect her mental health. Her family's survival was actually totally contingent upon her success. They were extremely poor. She grew up in rural Louisiana, and she was their entire family's meal ticket. And they all got involved in the family business of Britney Spears, whether she liked it or not. And that has shaped a fundamental belief that I still hold. And yes, this applies to everybody. I do not believe that parents can be deeply involved in the family business of a pop star without there being some level of psychological abuse, purposeful infantilization, and harm coming to the child. I simply don't believe that. I'm just being honest. And that applies to everybody. Everyone. And the simple fact, the reason why I believe that is that if your livelihood depends on your child's output, then you don't have a child anymore. You have an asset, and that is what your child becomes. And when your primary caregivers are financially dependent on your performance, there's no incentive to protect you from the machine consuming you. And I think that that is exactly what happened to Britney. What is the core tragedy of Britney Spears? In conclusion, it's that she stopped being a person. Her family stopped seeing her as a daughter, and they started seeing her as a revenue stream. The media stopped seeing her as a human and saw her instead as a spectacle. And the public stopped seeing her as a teenager or a young woman trying to mature and saw her as a battleground for morality and for all of our projections and our restrictions of misogyny, female sexuality, and humanizing women and allowing them to grow and develop their own autonomy. Every single person benefited from her exploitation. Nobody prioritized her psychological development, her emotional safety, or her autonomy. Britney was a product and turned into a dehumanized product long before she, quote unquote, broke down and stopped functioning like the marionette doll people tried to make her into. And once you understand this, then part 2 will become that much more unbearable. Because part 2 is where we talk about the timeline of events that lead up to what happens to a human being when you live inside that machine long enough and get pulled apart piece by piece. Join me then for part 2, which is going to be the postmortem. This, though, I feel, was the crime scene. So, anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this part. I hope you take care of yourselves, and I will see you shortly for part 2.